Yeah.
Okay. Good evening and a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us today. Primus Books is delighted to welcome you all to the launch of our new title, Forests, Foragers and Empires, Socio-Natural Histories of Southern India by Kathleen D. Morrison, with an emphasis on historical recognitions and misrecognitions arising from presumptions about human and non-human history, as well as about the presumed fundamental qualities of nature and culture. This book examines the complicated histories of South Indian forests and foragers. While some essays focus on the hunting and gathering peoples of southern India, particularly in light of their interactions with other people across the Holocene, other essays consider the large-scale landscape histories that they are positioned within, from the forests themselves to local and established networks of production, trade, and power. These histories include multiple forms of agencies: kings, hunters, merchants, farmers, sailors, city dwellers, and of course plants, animals, and the forests themselves. This collection of essays aims to reinsert both forests and foragers into mainstream South Asian history, including the history of European colonial expansion and conquest, as well as those of other imperial politics. I would now like to invite Dr. Prasun Chatterjee to address the audience. Prasun sir, you are on mute.
Thank you, Amrupali, and a good evening from Primus to everyone who have gathered here today. Rarely do we find a book which speaks equally to archaeologists, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, and specialists of ecology or gender, as we find in the chapters of Forest, Foragers, and Empires. It is a huge honor for Primus Books to publish the research of Professor Kathleen Morrison, who entrusted us with her manuscript. The founder of Primus Books, Mr. B.N. Verma, who commissioned this work and then saw it through its publication, provided his guidance while the book was being prepared on the editorial desk. Uh, the book was edited during the time of the pandemic and received a lot of support from our director, Mr. Sugat Jain, in terms of organizational uh, uh, support. We have been fortunate in the uh, support from of Professor Morrison, Mr. Verma, and then the panel of renowned experts we have here today, Professors Aloka Parasher-Sen, Mahesh Rangarajan, and Swadhin Sen, who have taken a keen interest in discussing the research integrated in this book. I welcome you all to this book launch and discussion, which we have been looking forward to. Thank you. Amrupali. Yeah.
Before we move on to the main event, please allow me to introduce this evening's discussion, beginning with our author. Kathleen D. Morrison is the Sally and Alvin B. Shoemaker Professor of Anthropology and lead curator, Asian section at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. Her research focuses on the historical ecology of Southern Asia, integrating paleo-environmental analysis, archaeology, and history. She is currently engaged in projects that include a global database of Holocene land use and South Indian landscape trajectories, a study of long-term histories of economic, social, and environmental change. She's the author of Daroji Valley, Landscape, Place, and the Making of a Dryland Reservoir System, co-author of the Vijayanagara Metropolitan Survey, and co-editor of The Social Lives of Forests, forest foragers, traders in South and Southeast Asia, and Empires, Perspectives from Archaeology and History. We also have three discussants with us this evening. Our first speaker, Aloka Parasher-Sen, retired as Professor of History from the University of Hyderabad, where she taught history for more than 4 decades. Her special focus is on the historical milieu and archaeology of the Deccan, alongside her main area of interest in the social history of early India, namely early Indian attitudes towards foreigners, tribes, and excluded castes. Some of her notable publications include Militias in Early India, Social and Economic History of Early Deccan, some interpretations, Settlement and Local History of the Early Deccan, and Seeking History Through Her Source, South of the Vindhyas. Her most recent book, Handbook on Urban History of Early India, was published in 2024. She is also the recipient of the first Professor Annapurna Chattopadhyay Award for the best book published on ancient India from a regional perspective at the Indian History Congress for her book Gender, Religion and Local History, The Early Deccan, published in 2023 by Primus Books. Our next speaker, Mahesh Rangarajan, is currently Professor of Environmental Studies and History at Ashoka University. He's been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University and has previously taught at the University of Delhi. He's also been visiting faculty at Cornell University, at Jadavpur, and in the National Center for Biological Sciences, Bengaluru. He was director, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and has also served as Vice Chancellor, Kriya University from 2021 to 22. His notable publications include India's Wildlife History, Environmental Issues in India, a Reader, India's Wildlife History, and has co-edited At Nature's Edge, Global History and the Long-Term Possible, amongst others. Our next speaker, Swadhin Sen, is professor at the Department of Archaeology at Jahangirnagar University. His area of interest include field archaeology, geoarchaeology, critical heritage studies, public archaeology, landscape archaeology. Currently, he is conducting studies under a project of paleoecology of Bengal and on structures and processes of heritage production. He is focusing on the entanglement of paleo-waterscape and paleo-landscape of Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna Delta with regard to archaeological and historical settlement pattern and transformations. He is deeply connected to rivers at a subjective and affective scale. He is working on two separate publications projects on the reports of archaeological surveying in northwestern part of Bangladesh and on the complexities of human-non-human interaction in the dynamic deltaic, tidal, and coastal regions of Bengal. After our speakers have all said a few words, we'll have a small question and answer session with the panelists. So if anyone has any question for Professor Morrison or the discussants, please feel free to leave your questions in the Q&A box below. I would now like to invite Professor Morrison, Professor Sen, Professor Rangarajan, and Dr. Sen to release the volume and hold it up for the audience.
I didn't bring mine to India.
Thank you so much, everyone. I would now like to invite Professor Morrison to talk about the book.
Oh, really, I'm here to listen more than to talk. But I will say just quickly, many thanks to Primus for their wonderful support, to these, my friends and incredibly esteemed panelists. I'm just so delighted that you took the time to do this. For the reader, I will just say quickly that, there's a big difference between a book that's written be a book all at once, and for the chapters to hang together, and a collection of essays, which this is, and it's a collection of essays written over a very long period of time. So in advance, I will just say there's a lot of redundancy because each of these pieces was meant to stand alone, and it was also written over a really long period of time. So, and I will say thank you to Mahesh in particular for encouraging me to put these together. This is actually only the first volume of a larger series. And Mahesh said it very bluntly to me. He said something like, Kathy, a lot of your papers, I don't know if you remember saying this, are obscurely published and nobody has access to them. So you should put them together somehow. So I think that was very great. And then finally, a special vote of thanks to my colleague at Penn, Ramya Srinivasan, who did a great deal of the copy of the proofreading on this volume when I was sick with long COVID. I was not really well enough to go through it. So Ramya read multiple sets of proofs just out of the goodness of her heart. So thank you to her as well.
Okay, thank you, Professor Morrison. Thank you for sharing your experience. I would now like to invite Professor Aloka Parasher-Sen to share her views on the book.
So thank you very much, Primus and everybody, for inviting me. This is an awesome, not awful, awesome panel discussion, a platform for all of us to share our ideas on this very relevant and very critical theme. And of course, it's a pleasure to introduce Kathleen Morrison's magnificent work on forest foragers and empires. I think Primus has done a really good job of putting this together. I'm familiar with what Professor Morrison, or Kathy, if I may say, has written, and but I think that the book finds a place for a long time for a larger audience of students and scholars, and for a very long time, I think this will remain a good, necessary, foundational study on forests, especially in the context of South Indian studies. Its scope is vast, but true to the nature of all her writings, it is intense and systematic. When I received the book, I found it really massive. Of course, but it was very light, but it was massive. But as I was going through it, I was at ease reading it. And I think all this credit goes to Kathy herself because she's organized it so well. I focused actually, I went through the book, but I focused closely on the first 3 chapters of the subsection on frameworks, followed by chapters 5 and 7, which was on the subsection on foragers, which I found very interesting. And then, of course, most interesting was the subsection on forests, maybe perhaps because I'm more familiar with having read and written on that. The introduction in each section, I think, was a brilliant idea. And it gives the readers a fantastic guide as to what is to follow in that chapter. And if one has to pick up one particular article that fascinated me most, which I read with genuine enthusiasm, it was Inventing the Primate Isolate, Imperial Margins and Anthropological Misrecognitions. And there is a reason why I felt so, because I really think that, this was written really well. It is a deep study that highlights critically the way representation of forest peoples as the other gets framed in pre-modern sources. And this is then contrasted by her with the misguided colonial constructions of the same. Actually, as students and scholars, we tend to unproblematically use the latter as sources for, doing our research even on pre-modern times. However, the significant point that she makes is that during pre-modern times, there is a more fluid and changing nature of these communities, forest communities, and this gives us a dynamic feel in that they interact with the non-forest world in various ways. And in the modern context, in contrast, this gets crystallized to give us an unchanging quote unquote isolate communities, leading to the erroneous impression as though they were all still living like bands in Paleolithic times. And true to the major thrust and arguments of the book, we are encouraged actually to look beyond the forest dweller as the pristine hunter-gatherer that emerged during the Stone Ages all over the world. Now, time is very limited in this discussion, and this will not permit us to go into all the points and the nitty-gritty of what Kathy has actually raised in many of the articles. From my perspective, I mean, which helps me to focus on the areas that I'm familiar with, I thought her initial question right in the beginning was very pertinent, and that was to quote, how can we reinsert Ghat peoples and landscapes into the dynamic histories of early historic South India? Because we all know and we are familiar with her work on the Vijayanagar, which had focused primarily on the agrarian worlds below the upland areas of the semi-arid regions of southern India, or what I would prefer to call the Deccan. The present concern that I want to raise is about these ghats and their semi-tropical forests and their spatial particularity, which I'll do in a while. But the second most important issue, which I think for the general reader, which I should mention over here, is that Kathy has persistently, almost repeatedly told us about why long-term histories matter. And she frames these to, quote, a new human ecology, unquote. And that, she says, needs to be analyzed as, to quote her again, historical political ecology. And you must read the beginning part of a book to understand the new human, the historical political ecology. It's not very difficult to do so. Where the lives of forager traders is contingent on the particular contexts, as well as on their long-term histories. So both these points, which she has flagged at the beginning of her book, stay with us throughout and are a sort of backbone for the studies undertaken, though, as she says, they were all written over different periods of time, to posit what she wants us to understand as total landscapes, which reflects on complex hunting and gathering behaviors. I would think that alongside spatial particularity and long-term temporal issues, I would like to add complexity and heterogeneity to the table. Peter J. Taylor's idea of unruly complexity of environments in his ecology interpretation engagements challenges us to dwell on environments that lie at the interstices of rich ecological diversity, that survive only in dependence with each other, and that we cannot put into linear frames of reference. So keeping this in mind, I'm compelled maybe to raise some questions for myself, actually. As you all know, reading a good book always energizes one to react to it, isn't it? And so I thought I could quiz Kathy on them, or maybe quiz myself. Partly on many of these issues, there's concurrence and we agree. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff which Kathy has mentioned in the book, and there's no way in which one can disagree with the larger arguments. But it's always enlightening to sort of raise these questions and try and understand the history of total landscapes and how the people there, how the history of the people there unfolds before us. So there were two broad issues with the time that I have. So I'm interested basically in especially in the context of the Deccan, the connection between pastoralists and foragers, how economic practices other than agriculture interjected with the lives of forest peoples. And people who were herders, cattle raisers and sheep and goat keepers, how usually they are marginalized in our discussions. And in the northern uplands of the Western Ghats, tapering into the Bhima and the Krishna valleys, for instance, we have communities like the Dangars and the Gavalis and others, and their movements. And many of their movements are between the forested areas of these regions and the grasslands. And in fact, there is a kind of a necessity for them to migrate with their herds and groups from one kind of forest landscape to another, especially in the monsoon habitations, which are located in the upland areas and are characterized by what are called dry, mixed, deciduous and thorny forests. And for the Gavalis in particular, they occupied these inaccessible reaches of the Ghats, and they shared this wild terrain with other wild species like the tigers, panthers, and others. They wouldn't hunt, but they would graze their buffaloes on suitably found patches in these areas. But very much like the Dangars, they also maintained a close relationship with the agriculturists on the one hand and the forest people on the other hand. And I could give another example, of course, which I think Kathy's already mentioned, and that is the Shola forests of the Nilgiris, where you have temperate forests which are endemic to the Western Ghats, and which are inhabited also by the tiger, elephant, and other wild animals. But because this is a perennial source of water and multi-species grasses, it's also the home for the Toda buffaloes. And this coexistence in these contiguous landscapes, I think, is very fascinating. And while elaborating on foraging, Kathy is very sensitive to this issue. To quote her here, she says, environmental and ecological context of South Asian foragers is largely undeveloped, unquote, and that she makes us feel the need to recognize that in our analyses of not only prehistoric, but more recently, but definitely recent foragers, we should include also those, quote again, those who farm, trade, keep animals, labor for wages, and so on and so forth. The other fascinating theme which I would like to just flag is the whole question of differentiating the forests, right? So this is very critical and very relevant to the content and analysis in the book. Basically, it's about how do we conceptualize the space of the forest. And of course, it's also closely related, which I found really very interesting, and that is the small section on problems of naming. Where is it a hunter-gatherer? Like, how do we name the foragers and so on and so forth? So we often overlook, I mean, this is like I'm speaking, we often overlook that in the earliest textual traditions, allusions to forest communities were actually designated by their individual names. Even in the context of the Ganga Valley, many of them lived in forests that were not far off. They were not distant lands, not to be visited or not to have visitors from. So these hunting groups inhabiting these areas over a period of time, either permanently, as in the case of the Shabaras and Pulindas, or temporarily, as in the case of the Nishadas, Kiratas, and all that, get excluded over the long durée, not in short historical terms. But however, unconsciously, we tend to want to use labels in defining them. So we are talking about Atavika Jatis, which are those living in wild forests, but terms like Vanachara or Aranyachara, which inform us about spaces that were very close to habitations and were dynamically interacting with them, we tend to overlook those forests, right? And I think it is here that the foragers that Professor Morrison is focusing on came into contact with economic practices that enabled them to be historical actors contributing to the larger activities of herding animals, trade, while also acquiring valuable forest produce for medicinal and other purposes. So I call this the dynamic vana, which provided the organic and critical link between the wild forest and habitable space, truly an interactive space, but an ambiguous zone nonetheless between the forest and the city. And finally, of course, Kathy also discusses this issue in what she calls the so-called quote unquote impure hunter-gatherers, that is, those involved in non-foraging others. She notes that we have to accept that, to quote her again, we face complex and long-term histories of engagement between peoples organized in very different ways. On the other hand, on the role of the foragers as traders, which she has focused on substantially, I just had a quick bite about when Professor Gunther Santheimer told us that the etymology of the word Banjara actually comes from the term Vanachara, meaning literally roaming in the forests. Now, the last section, of course, I'm not going to discuss, but maybe we can take it up in question and answers. And that was about the whole question of othering the forest dwellers. But at the same time, while there is this othering going on, the state has a major role to play in how the forests and the forest communities are to be handled. And of course, it ultimately culminates in the historical period about the making of settlements. And many of the place names, etc., have the memory of the forest encapsulated in the names that we give many sites and many settlements. So I do not think that there's an absolute notion, which I think is also primarily what Kathy is arguing, that though the control of the forest and the forest products and so on and so forth become very significant when state emerges and when empires begin to control, there is also the concern of the state to not totally exclude the forest dwellers. In fact, for example, it's very well known that in the Arthashastra, the certain kinds of forest people were made to settle down in the border areas between settled communities and the deep forest, or that there was an Atavi Bala or a special unit of forest people in the army and so on and so forth, so that there is no absolute total exclusion that we should be looking for, and that there is a continued interaction. In fact, I remember in the writing in the context of Rajasthan, B.D. Chattopadhyay once drew our attention to a settlement in the forest, which grew into prominence when communities here wanted to start an agara or an operation of a mine. And appropriately, the name of the place was Aranya Kupagiri, literally meaning a forest product on the hill. So this says much about the way many of the points raised by Kathy can be understood. And there are innumerable examples. My particular concern with focusing on the Deccan was just simply to say that these landscapes, that is the mixed farming, agro-pastoral base, these provided a very suitable space of interaction between different modes of spatial cohabitation, without neglecting the crucial role of the hunter-gatherers. And I remember when we were starting our studies, Olchen gave us this fantastic example of how technology of the late Stone Age tool making persisted and continued to have a close relationship with trade of the Deccan Chalcolith communities. So let me conclude then. I mean, and there's a lot more to say on the settlements and so on and so forth. But I think that these indicators of the contact that foragers had with trading communities, with agrarian and pastoral communities, and other examples support Professor Morrison's basic hypothesis on the role of forager traders, who need to be incorporated into our historical narratives like any other communities. But for all this, we need to have a long-term historical framework, while at the same time emphasizing on the particularity of spatial context. It goes without saying that a singular term to define all types of forest or forest communities encased within rigid boundaries of definition have to be given up. For how we should go about doing this, or how we should proceed forward, we have this book, and we are releasing today. And while thanking Professor Morrison for having put it together, I do believe all of us to take a look at it more closely and get and benefit, of course, from its contents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sen, for discussing the book thematically and for your very valuable observations. I'm sure it was very helpful for the audience. Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Professor Rangarajan to share his views on the book.
Thank you, Amrapali. It's a privilege and honor to be here today. So I firstly want to felicitate my very distinguished friend and colleague, Professor Morrison. This is a very significant work. It is important for a variety of reasons. And I think Primus has done more than justice to this. And I think the author, the way the book has been introduced, the way each section has been highlighted, this will stand out as a pathfinder and milestone. I'm not saying this because she's a friend and because I'm familiar with some of the papers, but I think one way to pose it is, what is the larger significance of the work? Why does it stand out? What could possibly make it a milestone? And there is something that goes beyond the book and what are the major themes in it. Forests, foragers, and empires, the social natures of southern India. The empire, of course, knits together the forest and the forager. But in one sense, this book shows us that we should not speak in terms of binaries, ecology and society, history and nature, polity and environment. It also is very important because besides the long duty, which of course is a special feature of the book, the early historic and the late historic period, it also shows the enormous significance of specific short periods of time. So there is enormous emphasis, for instance, on the spice trade of the mercantilist European empires, the Portuguese, Dutch, and English, as there is in one of the chapters on the Western Ghats, on the enormous significance of the enclosure of the forest in late 19th century. But I think for me, and I share this with a very distinguished fellow panelist, Professor Parasher-Sen, what stands out for me is the forest, that it's a space which is not outside in terms of space or time, of history, the evolution, adaptation of human societies over time. And the history in turn is not to be seen minus ecology. We can't look at state building only in terms of capital, labor, armies, nobles, kings, queens, labor, all of those issues. We also need to look at what was earlier known as nature or natural capital. So the forest is a biophysical space. It's also human space. And the animals, the plants are actants and actors, as are the forest users and residents. They're evolving, adapting, changing, and contesting. And one of the very important features of this book is that it reminds us of the forest scape. I use the term forest scape rather than landscape because it brings together plants, soils, animals, and waters. In her previous book on the Dauroji Valley, I think Professor Morrison showed how this Vijayanagaram emerged and had a long-term impact on landscapes and was in turn dependent on weather patterns and the kinds of water and animal and plant resources and soils of the area. Similarly, I think this book does something very significant. It brings these forests into a larger transoceanic history. It's very striking, as someone interested in vertebrate history, to find the ivory of the male Asian elephant so important in trade going back to Roman times. And similarly with plants, pepper, related, of course, to the particular genus, and the male-female flowers. And so the exchange relates not only to the temples and the consecration of rituals in the temples and the aromatics and the various herbs and flowers brought in from the forest, but also and to the kings and courts, but also to trade. And I think there's something very important in terms of exchange. We look at exchange in terms of appropriation. The exchange also creates value. And one of the significant points is that this long-term trade, and the Malabar coast is, of course, the Kanara coast has been involved in trade for over 2,300 years. So I think the nature of this trade, of course, changes over time, but it's very significant to keep this in mind. I'm struck, of course, by the fact that the empire is therefore engineer of ecosystems. And one of the points very strongly made in this book repeatedly, and quite rightly repeatedly, is that Vijayanagar is perhaps not the likeliest site for an empire. It's in a somewhat semi-arid zone. It's not like, if you'll permit me, like the Cholas who were settled in the very rich Kaveri basin, the delta and all that. But the creation of this oasis of irrigated agriculture has enormous implications well beyond it. In fact, one may question whether we should simply say hinterland and argue that this so-called hinterland is vital to the flourishing of that empire. It's as important as the horses that are imported across the Western Indian Ocean. And it is significant because this knitting together is not only in material terms, but in symbolic terms. This is very much Professor Parasher-Sen's area, but I am fascinated by the fact that there are inscriptions in a temple of Shiva and the Chenchu woman jointly hunting the tiger. and there is Narasimha removing, horn from the Chenchu Lakshmi's flesh, from her foot. But I am very fascinated by the first because the hunting of a tiger, the Vyagra, the largest of the land predators, an eater of flesh, the Puli or the Huli in southern India, and the Vyagra of the Sanskrit text, is a sign of domination of the forest. What is being hunted is not just the tiger. It is the conquest of the forest landscape, assertion of power. And is it being indicated, for instance, that Shiva, who is very important as a deity, who has associations with forest peoples, with Kiratas, he joins the Chenchu in subduing the tiger? Is it a taming of the tiger? And is the taming of the tiger being celebrated at the temple, which is, of course, very important, whether we look at Sri Sailam or Ahobilam or any of these famous temples, there is royal patronage involved. So I'm absolutely fascinated by this. Similarly, the Narasimha as a half lion, half man with the Chencho. This is fluidity. This is transition. We think of animals and humans as different. I mean, these are eras and periods when people didn't think of animals and humans as different. The idea of shape-shifting would have come naturally to. So I think that this is the great strength of this book. It looks at the significance of fluidity. There's a point, of course, Professor Morrison has made more than once about the fact that you don't have something called deforestation in the long historical period. You have the advanced retreat and the renewal of the forest vegetation, or the jungle, if I may call it. Rather than that, let's be more specific. You have the retreat advance and retreat of the cultivated area. Because what replaces the cultivated area probably shouldn't be called the forest. We may want to call it secondary growth. Even that term is problematic. And this is where I think this book is significant. It problematizes each of these terms in a what is the correct word? In a milieu where ecological questions are simply seen as to be solutionized. So this whole idea of Western Ghats being a pristine landscape, therefore it has to be preserved, is solutionizing, when she problematizes by showing it's far from pristine. Identical with the notion of peoples as primitive and relics whose cultures should be preserved and protected. I mean, laudable as these aims are, we don't want those cultures to be obliterated, but it is problematic because they have been actors, they have been participants, there have been very important contests in the past. What is it which I think I'd like a little more elaboration of? It's unfair. The book is 400 pages. There'll always be more questions. But what are the two things I was really struck by? Well, one is, what is the role of war in this whole process? It seems to me war making is very significant. And the other is, what is the difference between short periods of time, which have a huge impact, and long duty changes? Drawing from my own work, I'm struck by two things, and these are very small comments, that I still see this late, 19th century, late 18th as a significant period as change. Not because the previous period was unchanging, because I do think that the nature of the relationship of the uncultivated space and cultivated arable changes in the late 19th century. It probably originates in British dislike of mobile peoples, of large animals, which are seen as unruly, uncivilized. And it, of course, dominates in large forest enclosures, which puts an end to open access and commons and properties. And of course, it's fascinating. There is a parallel of the extermination or protection of large vertebrates and of these what are called forest peoples. So in that sense, I think this is a very significant book. It brings together two very different traditions of scholarship, of society and nature, which have operated far too often in silos. It does so through fine-grained analysis of not just pollen samples and archaeological digs, but an interweaving of the results of these very painstaking, and I must emphasize the word painstaking, over 30, 35 years of 40 years of research, with all kinds of other evidence, epigraphic, textual, scholarship of others, secondary literature, and a very, if I may use the word, active engagement and critical engagement with a vast range of scholarship. It's not always in a book on Southern India you find, connections with Southeast Asia and sea slug collection in the Andamans and edible swiftlets and the Malay and Chinese who came into the Andamans and pre-state exchange. But you're reminded once again of something of which recurs through Professor Morrison's work. And I'll end with this, that the landscape of South Asia, southern India particularly, and the rest of South Asia has had human presence for very long, 65, 70,000 years. Hominid presence for, who knows, 1 to 3 million years. And these are lifescapes. They have been inhabited by people, and their role hasn't entirely been destructive. This is not to suggest that we should not put checks and balances in place today. So thank you. It has been a great pleasure, and I hope I've kept to my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rangarajan, for sharing your observations on the book. I'm sure it was very enriching for all of us here. I would now like to invite Dr. Swadhin Sen to share his thoughts on the book.
Thank you, Amrupali. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay, first I would like to apologize because currently I am in power cut. So I am running on my inverter and mobile data. And in fact, I was really fascinated when my friend, Professor Kathleen Morrison, asked me whether I will be available to discuss her new book, which is, of course, we are talking about right now. I was fascinated, and I said yes immediately, because for a long time I am reading her work, and we are also discussing many of the issues on especially ecology, on paleoecology and historical archaeology for a long time. And after seeing this book, I have found that several of these papers have already been referred by me, or already been discussed by me in our classes, in our classrooms. So in a sense, I am a little bit of unfit here, because I am not very familiar with the South India. And at the same time, I am very embedded in this Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna Delta and its surrounding regions. In that sense, I was fascinated to read some of the papers again. And as it has been mentioned by Kathleen in the introduction section, that these papers have been written over a long period of time, and and she didn't want to renew or reframe or correct some of the disparities, and that she has already mentioned in the introduction section. Particularly, I would like to, I didn't have much time to reread or rethink about all the papers, but the chapter 2, 4, 5, 8, 9, 10, and especially the last section was very fascinating for me, because we are experiencing the same issues, same problems, and same questions when we are working in this area of the subcontinent. In that sense, when I was reading some of the papers, I was recalling my fascinating experience and my excitement when I was reading The Dawn of Everything, written by David Graeber and these archaeologist anthropologist collaboration, and where I was finding many of the answers or many of the issues that we were talking about. And at the same time, when I was going through some of the works by some of the environmental historians or the people who are working on ecology, like Dilip Da Kunha and the others, that also reminded me the importance of the chapters and the works, studies that has been done and presented in this book. In that sense, this book is a very important contribution for the people like us who are working in a zone which is very problematic. Why it is very problematic? Because the engagement with the environment or ecology, I am using these two terms because both of these terms have been used by Kathleen in her book, though both of these terms have different connotations. So those who are working here, we can find broadly two trends of scholarship. One trend that is dominated by definitely textual and archival material, and the another trend which is dominated by these archaeological or geoarchaeological or zooarchaeological, paleobotanical understanding of the past. And Kathleen has rightly mentioned that we have just left the archaeology for the past where there is no text, that is the prehistory. And for the historical period, we are more concentrated on the textual or epigraphic sources, and especially the colonial archives. So that is an interesting problem and challenging problem for us who try to just break these boundaries and try to engage with the past human non-human interaction within a transdisciplinary framework, like the dawn of everything, where it has been mentioned several times that the nomadic people or these foragers or these hunter-gatherers, the way they have been perceived and constructed even in the dominant traditions of archaeological knowledge, that the last 10 years have completely changed those assumptions. Even for the South Asia. For example, if we look at the works of Professor Robi Korisetar and Shina Pappu and the others, there are certain things that challenges the understanding of the prehistory, even in South Asia. Simultaneously, there are people who are living in two different periods, which is completely challenging. Some people are living in, according to the dominant periodization, some people are living in the lower Paleolithic. At the same time, some people are living in the Mesolithic. So how do you understand all these simultaneity of the space and time? And even the understanding of the ecology has been challenged by several people. Even the people who follows the evolutionary framework, they are also putting forward a third view of the evolution. That is how did the process of evolution really occur? Whether the Darwinian assumption of the survival of the fittest actually happened or not. Those are the questions that occurred, or that just happened to challenge me while I was reading these papers. So in that sense, Kathleen's book, in a sense, is extremely thought-provoking, as well as it has challenged me to think my embodied existence in the Ganges Brahmaputra Meghna Delta, as well as in the surrounding Himalayan Piedmont Plain, which is relatively neglected in the historical understanding or archaeological understanding of South Asia, for example, in the northeastern part of India. At the same time, I was recalling that some of the very important contributions of on the paleoecological research have occurred in this zone. For example, Sebastian Breitenberg and others have worked in this northeastern part of the India. They have very interestingly, they have shown the century scale variation of the monsoon, and how can we relate those proxy data on the monsoon variability with the human ecology or the paleoecology of this region of the eastern part of the South Asia. That is what I was thinking about. And at the same time, whether this forest as a homogeneous term or as an universal term for South Asia is really applicable. That is what I was thinking, because in the deltic plain of Bengal, we are dealing with the mangrove forest of Sundarban. The dynamic there is very different. At the same time, in the southeastern part, we are dealing with the eastern Himalayan range, as well as the big and vast water bodies in the, for example, in the Tripura, Meghalaya, Assam, and as well as in the Kumilla, Brahmanbaria, Chattogram of Bangladesh. So there is a question of scale, and there is a question of context, and there is a question of how would we engage with these global in terms of pan-Indian scale and local spatio-temporality in understanding or in engaging with the past environment or past ecology, as well as the human involvement with this past ecology. In that sense, for example, I was just yesterday, I was reading one epigraphy source, which is very famous. It was discovered from the northeastern part of Bangladesh, where it was mentioned that there was the inscription, copperplate inscription was issued by Sri Chandra, one of the rulers from the Chandra dynasty of Bengal. And there it has been mentioned that the boatmen are looking through some forest for the medicinal plants. And they are describing the forest as the Lalambi Bon. And at the same time, I was just correlating it with the first census in Bengal in 1872, where it was a great mistake made by the colonial or company census people to not count the people who were staying or living in the boat. So these boatmen or boat traveling, mobility by boat, how do we include them within the category of nomadic people, or whether we can include them in the nomadic people, because they were temporarily on the boat for a particular season in the year, and then they settled, they live the settled life elsewhere. So there are multiplicity of human experience with the ecological settings in entire South Asia. And we have to face the challenge of correlating as well as interpreting this history of this ecology, human, or as we mentioned right now, the human, non-human interaction in terms of these multiplicities. And I don't think that the division or the separation which exists in the current scholarship, like some people emphasize on the textual or epigraphic sources, or some people emphasize on the archaeological or landscape sources, that will not be very helpful. And it has been mentioned by none other than Dipesh Chakraborty also, and Amitabh Ghosh also, that this interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary framework or understanding has to be developed. Even the fictions on the land and rivers and people, that can also contribute to our understanding or re-understanding and rethinking of our assumptions about the people, about their life. And finally, I would like to congratulate Kathleen for gifting us with a book which can allow us to think beyond one singular or one linear narrative. That is the most important thing I have found about this book. And it will help us, and it will encourage us, it will inform us living in different environmental settings or ecological settings in South Asia to think beyond the normal and the dominant traditions and to challenge our boundaries. So again, I would like to thank Primus for inviting me, as well as the very eminent and reputed panelist, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan and Professor Aloka Parasher-Sen, and also especially Prashan for including me in the panel. And thank you, and good night.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sen, for sharing your views on the book. So we don't have questions, but we do have a couple of comments, and these are directed to Professor Morrison. Meghna Agarwal has said there are many of us here who have read your papers and cite them in our work. And another comment is from Ranjita, who says that Professor Morrison, I use your work on Vijayanagar Metropolitan Survey extensively during my teaching. So we just have a couple of comments. We don't have any questions. I cannot see questions here.
Can I respond to some of the discussions? Okay, I will go ahead.
Yes.
I really
Yes.
thank all of you because each one of you in your own world knows so much more than I do about these topics. And I can't respond to every single thing, but I just wanted to give a kind of general musing about the issue of data, right? Of information. And it's nice, thanks Swadhin for coming on to have another archaeologist also here on the panel. I mean, as Aloka pointed out, really the majority of my work has been about agriculture and farmers and settled peoples. So for me, a lot of issue is which kinds of archives, and if we think about archives not only as texts but also paleoenvironmental data and archaeological data, art historical data, which kind of archives give us what kind of information, right? And what kind of archives gives us information continuously? Very few, right? So if we're talking about, say, the 18th century, we have multiple kinds of historical archives, but there's actually, shockingly, almost no archaeological archive for the 18th century. There could be, but there isn't so much because archaeologists haven't done that kind of work. So this is a real challenge we have in all parts of South Asia, is that the evidence we have is very spotty. In putting together this global land use data that was mentioned in the introduction, we found that for Bangladesh, at 6,000 years ago, and I spoke to Swadhin about it, is we don't have any archaeological sites with secure dates. I don't think that there was nobody living in the entire country of Bangladesh at that time, but it reflects the colonial and post-colonial, political, economic, lack of research, really. Bangladesh is more like the size of Germany, right? There are hundreds of thousands of radiocarbon dates from Germany. So a lot of, what we're doing here in this book is just putting together little scraps of information, and very little of it that I've actually generated, because most of my work has been on these other topics. So if we think about archives, we ask, what kind of information? What is the temporal scope of the information? And Swadhin is also right that the periods of time that inappropriately in many ways are called prehistory. So still periods with history. It's just that there are periods without text. Things did happen, and we should know about those. And then whose interests are being represented in archives? or in texts. This is something obviously historians have thought a lot about. So what we see, for example, in some of the hunter-gatherer, forager, trader work is there is a lot of focus in my writing on trade, partly because that's why I started looking at that, because I was just interested in it. But also because when people who are themselves perhaps not literate or producing texts appear in texts, it's because they're doing something other people are interested in. So there's no doubt many interesting things that they're doing that are, not recorded. Pastoralism is a great case in point, and Aloka is exactly right, that's something that's almost entirely missing. So I will say that, just to give you a sense, for those of you who are not archaeologists, what's involved in trying to get that information, pastoralists and foragers are both hard to find in historical documents, but experts like Aloka know. When we excavated the archaeological site of Karibaglu, very close to right on the Tungabhadra River, we excavated material from the Iron Age, so it's about 1200 BCE to about 300 BCE. And one of my PhD students analyzed all of the animal bones. We spent 10 years excavating, screening. She did a dissertation on the animal bones. And we learned, as a few other people have also learned, that in the Iron Age and actually earlier in the Neolithic too, cattle were being used for traction. Very interesting. They have like arthritis, in their joints. And that herds of goats were being optimized for dairy production. That seemed pretty clear. That was one site and 10 years of work. And unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of comparative evidence from other places to do that kind of thing. The pastoralists also, have been very much on my mind, and I've thought about them, especially in terms of their interactions with agriculturalists, although certainly the forager connections are important as well. And if you think it's still important, of course, pastoralism in the Deccan and their interaction, especially with dry farmers. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out if crops were manured. So there are some archaeological ways to do that. Also, I spent 2 years learning stable isotope analysis, so we could start looking at nitrogen isotopes. So this is sounding defensive, which is not what I intend, but just to say that the nature of evidence is so choppy, it's so disjointed and involves a lot of work, and particularly on the archaeological and paleoecological side, we're way behind the historians. I mean, you all have been working on this for a long time, but many of these kinds of strategies, we're just starting out. So the variability of forests also, as Aloka raised, is a really important question. So what kinds of archives tell us about not just forests, but other vegetation assemblages, that things like pollen data. So more of that needs to be done, definitely. The question that Mahesh raises about tempos of change and temporal scope, that again is also important, and a challenge because of the way in which we get information about the dating of things, right? So there are ways of dating texts, obviously, but there are different ways of dating archaeological and paleoecological records. And that brings us then sort of back to Swadhin's question or comment about what he called people living in different time periods. So you have people living in the Paleolithic, living in the Mesolithic, whatever, living in the modern period, all side by side. Of course, they're not. I mean, they're together in when you say actual time, they're contemporaneous, right? So that kind of idea that some people live in the past, as it were, or some people are medieval where other people are modern, is what Johannes Fabian famously called a denial of coevalness, right? The problem is not the people, the problem are the frameworks, right? So it isn't that some people lived in the Paleolithic while other people were living in the modern period. It's our notions about temporality, right? And that's that kind of periodicity. So this is something that archaeologists and historians all struggle with, right? We've seen representations of the history of India, as Hindu, Muslim, British, and then it gets very minorly changed to ancient, medieval, and modern. And in the same way, in archaeology, we have different kinds of European-derived frameworks like Paleolithic, Mesolithic, et cetera, imposed on at times and places that really are incredibly complex. And I like the term, and I had not heard that before, but of unruly complexity. But we have these kinds of dominant narratives of change, that we seem to be attached to, no matter what the nature of the actual evidence is. So the kinds of frameworks that we have inherited as kind of post-colonial, the coloniality of these frameworks from ancient, medieval, modern to Neolithic, Iron Age, and so on, that don't fit very well in South Asian time and space, but no singular kind of structure like that would fit very well in time and space, because we have an extraordinary diversity, which is probably what we have everywhere as well, right? I don't think it's just like South Asia is special in that sense. So I hope that, and I'm so honored that all of you, came and spoke about, say, a series of repetitive essays that have been published over decades. And that was at one point sort of, I would say, my hobby was the forager part, not my main work, just my hobby. But I'm really encouraged by the comments by students too, and young scholars that, some of the empirical work that we've done, the Vijayanagara Metropolitan Survey or the pollen work or whatever it is, has inspired them to do their work. And I think that that's really bodes well for the future of historical research in South Asia, that we can, unlike some other parts of the world, I think maybe because we're smaller and scrappier in some ways, we can work together. We can have historical data, archaeological data, paleoecological data, and it's not perfect, the connections, and but we can operate in terms of trying to understand these landscapes, total landscapes. So I feel very encouraged, actually, I will say, and thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Morrison. We do have a question from Aritri Chakraborty, and I'd like to read it out to you. What is Professor Morrison's take on the scholarly engagements that deal with focus or lean towards agency of a singular species rather than seeing history as product of multiple and concurrent agencies? In terms of methodology and doing actual hands-on research, how can we actually translate such inquiries into our work? As Professor Morrison in her scholarship has helped us to demystify various academic frameworks that we take for granted as innocent ones, I ask these questions. Therefore, is it landscape or spatial configuration that continue to be stable category for writing history?
Thank you. That's a very nice question. I mean, of course, the singular species we've mostly studied is humans. And I think that, as Mahesh also pointed out, I mean, it's critically important to realize that humans are only, one element in an entire world full of physical, biological, and other kinds of beings. Studying non-human worlds requires, different kinds of methods also. And, famously, those methods have been dominated by the sciences. And famously, the humanities and the sciences have not always spoken to one another. So let me just get back to the second part of the question instead of just rambling on and on. Let's see. In terms of hands-on research, how can we translate? Oh, yes, that is a very difficult question. And, I think that if we think about the range of strategies for understanding the past, whether it's short-term or long-term, small region, large region, if we want to do something that's, maybe come to be called landscape studies, or call it what you want, but it's a kind of approach that is about a world in which humans are important and present, but they're not the only thing there, right? Then we're going to have a lot of different kinds of analytical methods. And none of us can do all of this by ourselves. You know, I tried to learn as many different kinds of techniques as I can, but you know, I'm never going to be a text scholar or something like that. I mean, so the way that it works is that we have to work together, right? We have to think carefully about research design and what kinds of, but we can share questions. You know, we can share curiosities, we can share concerns, and then we have to be, you know, pretty honest about the limitations as well of our data. You know, I'm in Bangalore right now, getting ready to go up to Chitradurga district in central Karnataka, where we're doing a new project, and it involves a lot of people. You know, so there will be different people doing different kinds of things. If you're a student, especially, how can you can't do that necessarily right away, right? But if you think about how you fit into the larger picture, you know, and ask important, interesting, you know, kind of big questions, and realize that it's okay not to really know the answers. You know, a lot of times in writing about the foragers and the forest, I have to say, it seems so elusive. I mean, where's the information? Where's the evidence? You know, I really feel like it was, you know, sort of knitting a sweater out of scraps I found on the ground or something like that. But we all, you know, over the course of, it's embarrassing to say, but it's actually this month, almost this week, it's been 40 years since I first came to India. So, and it's taken a while, but we've learned a lot, you know, collectively. And I think that it's just going to get better and better, you know, so I'm excited about you young folks and your projects as well.
Thank you, Professor Morrison, for answering that. I don't think we have more questions. Yeah, we don't have any more questions. So,
Can I ask a follow-up to that? Because I want to.
Sure,
I think
Professor.
this is very. Yeah, it's a very interesting question raised. The singular species history not working, and I was just wondering, you know, when Carlo Cipolla was asked the single most important change of last 1,000 years of European history, he was given 700 words. It's a syndicated column. He said the most important change in European history in 1,000 years, before 2000, was the coming of the bean and the threefold system because of leguminous crops and the bacteria which fix nitrogen in the soil. Similarly, Mark Elvin has written about retreat of elephants and extermination being critical for rice bag. So actually, I want to link this to Professor Aloka's question. You know, this India is home to not only 1.4 billion people, but 300 million domestic ungulates, the cattle, buffaloes, sheep, goats. And they now outnumber the wild ungulates. So this question, in a sense, have humans enabled through selection certain type of ungulates. And I'm sure if we measure the size of these animals today, compared to, I don't know, 500,000, 2,000 years ago, it will be very different in certain areas. We have bred them selectively in a way. But in a sense, they have also gained from the human footprint expanding. So I'm just wondering, you know, this botany of desire type of argument, is there an animality of desire? Because it's fascinating globally how much the domestic ungulate population outnumbers the wild ungulates. It's a huge transformation. And so this multi-species history, can we bring the animals in? And in this case, of course, I know nothing about this, the domestic animals. Does this sort of ring a bell? Because I'm very struck in your work by what you have written about female and male pepper vines, you know, which grow in the forest. Now, obviously, those vines decide to grow wherever they are. They are not cultured, but there may be certain plants which are cultured in the forest, which you have referred to repeatedly. But these animals are bred as domesticated animals. Some of them are only semi-domesticated. There's a big debate whether buffaloes are at all domesticated in India. They roam around and come back for salt. Sorry, I'll hand over to Professor.
Or mosquitoes, right? In terms of multi-species, mosquitoes have had a big impact on us.
Can I just say very briefly one thing? Of course, Kathy is right that all of us can't be experts in all kinds of evidence and sources. But one of the things about the connect between the wild forest and the more habitable or settled areas was that in texts like the Vriksha Ayurveda, that is the knowledge about trees and plants and so on and so forth, there was a category which sort of fascinated me, which said that there is something called Upavana Kriya. That is, you mimic the forest. And in these Upavana Kriya areas, this whole question of the coexistence of these traders, forager traders, and then these cattle breeders, actually, in the context of the Deccan, the ethnographic work done by Dandekar, Swantaima, and all that indicates that cattle rearing gave way to sheep rearing and so on and so on. What happened to cattle? Right, at some point in time. Now, this is ethnographic work. I cannot sort of talk about the archaeological evidence and so on and so forth. But the very fact that even today, the Deccan landscapes and the way of life, if you look at your area of study or your regional context and all, domesticated animals and their dependence on them is almost absolute. Agriculture in dry areas, of course, you've shown brilliantly how there is a transition from mixed farming into rice cultivation, and the palette of the of the South Indian from millet and ragi and all to rice, etc., etc., has been a historical process. The fact of the matter is that in many communities, seed diversity, the millet growing is a reality of everyday existence. So cattle and cattle rearing or sheep, goat, etc., very central to the specificity of these regions, which we are discussing, which like your focus is on. So that is why the question of that. I'm not, simply talking about herds of cattle or herds of sheep, but it's the coexistence between these different modes of cohabitation that I think we really need to think about in the future, right? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, Dr. Sen also has something to say.
I just would like to add 2 points, taking a cue from Professor Rangarajan's intervention, that in fact, according to this, whether human-centric history or human-centric archaeology, we can interact very intimately with the people who are also living right now in different environmental settings. Even though modernity and colonialism have changed many of our assumptions and way of living. For example, if we talk about this Sundarban, the people around Sundarban think of Sundarban as an alive and living being. And at the same time, rivers are also perceived as living and sentinel being. So in many texts, for example, there are interesting references and works where we'll find textual evidences of animals who talk, who have languages. Shivaji Bandopadhyay from Bengal, and also I think Professor Aloka Parasher-Sen said one of the edited volume have included some of the papers where there are mentions of this perception of, say, animal world, where animals have their own language. They talk in terms of the human conditions, and they have also have some kind of ethical and moral agency. So the question of how do we engage with these non-human agents or agencies, we can go beyond this human centrism. And if we take deep dive into this ethnographic world and interaction with the people, then we can find many of the signatures or evidences, even these days, that people are living in a world where they don't separate or they don't disjunct between human and non-human, like we do in academia, or we do as experts. So that is one point I wanted to add. Another point I just forget to mention that we categorize people as foragers, as pastoralists or agriculturists. That categorization is valid to some extent, but there are also some people who live partly as agriculturists, partly as pastoralists, or partly as foragers. Uh, uh, Annually, if we take the yearly cycle, you will find people who cultivate land for a particular time of the year, and then they become nomadic, or then they become traders or foragers. So how can we engage with these categories where the categories are not fixed? They are fluid. And even I can mention one of the work. I know one student who is working in, I think Kathleen knows her, Buishaki. She has discovered some of the interesting remains of sculpture in the mountainous region of Kashmir and Ladakh. And there are no other evidence of human occupation or habitation. And this mountainous landscape, which was perceived as some kind of a boundary or some kind of uh, a kind of uh, one kind of some kind of embankment for interaction with the people, can be perceived also as a zone of interaction and mobility. So the perceptions and assumptions are being continuously changing. And as archaeologists, we may not find evidences or archaeological evidences as per se in many places or many spaces where people moved around, where people moved around for a long distance in a particular period of the year or in a particular season, and again settled for a particular period of the year. So these are the complexities that we need to deal with. That is why I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sen. So I'd now like to conclude the event. Before we end this evening's program, we'd like to say that it's been wonderful to be a part of this event. On behalf of our organization, I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guests, Professor Aloka Parasher-Sen, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, and Dr. Swadhin Sen. We are also very grateful to Professor Morrison for giving us the opportunity to publish her book. Sincere thanks are also due to Mr. Sugat Jain, Mr. B.N. Verma, Dr. Prasun Chatterjee, and the entire team of Primus for their cooperation. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you present here for finding the time to be with us today. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to one and all. So we can all leave the meeting. Thank you so much.